Over the last few years, I've read hundreds of light novels. I tell you what, after a while, I've started to find some of the tropes or themes are really starting to grate on me. So, in this video, I'm going to vent and share them all with you. And of course, this is all my own opinion. I am, of course, an Englishman reading Japanese literature for young teens. And to be truthful, with most of these things, you know what? There are always good examples of how some of these things have been done rather well. Well, with some of them anyway. So take what I'm talking about with a grain of salt. And of course, if you've got any examples of what you think is a good example of a particular thing that I'm not fond of, let me know in the comments. I always appreciate new recommendations. Let's get looking at this list, shall we? Forced school arcs. You know how it is. You get people hooked with the first volume, you introduce a few unique characters, you get an interesting little bit of plot there. And then, what happens next? The school training arc. Now, for me, this is an immediate red flag. I'm painfully aware that most people reading these books are going to be people still attending school. But you know what? A lot of the time, these just feel forced. I don't mind if it starts off and we are already in school. That makes sense. There are a lot of really good school-based series out there that I can't really complain about. And you know what? It has been done rather well in a few other series like Ascendance of a Bootworm and Silent Witch. It's when it comes to these ones like the Isakai, and you know, you've seen it many times before. It's the first few chapters, then we're getting a little bit of story, then straight away, oh, but I need to go to school to learn something. You know the ones I'm talking about. The popular jock who the protagonist needs to beat up, the comic relief, the girl who was bullied for being normal, the girl who's clearly waifu bait, the class president who was powerful, with bonus points if this is a girl who is also waifu bait. The headmaster who's a wise and old sensei but ultimately ends up being pretty much nothing. The school bullies who are useless. And that mysterious thing in the school that has been there forever but the protagonist just stumbles upon it and resolves it without any issue. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, a lot of the time I just instantly check out. Even with some of these like Silent Witch, it took me a while to actually get into it because I didn't really expect it to be a school series, but it did it well enough that I enjoyed it. So there are always good examples of these particular ones, but more often than not, it's just kind of a, well, you know what, most of the people reading this, they're going to school, we'll plonk a school arc in here too. While I appreciate the idea that you can pretend you're the protagonist and live a life that is just so much better than your actual school one, it's definitely something that has been way overdone and feels like something people have to include rather than something too meaningful. The unpopular guy who is actually really popular. Now, school arcs can be quite boring, but you know what's even more boring? The protagonist who constantly complains that he isn't popular, yet in reality is super popular. This is one that I just find tiresome. Just be honest with your character. If he's popular with characters, make it so. It's the guy who is socially awkward, doesn't know how to talk to girls or their classmates, but within a few chapters he's either isekai to another world where being useless is novel because you remembered how to make ramen, and automatically you are now super popular and able to talk to just about anybody. And again, I know that this is yet another way of escapism for people reading it. I'm well aware that some people who are reading these particular titles are possibly the unpopular characters at their own school. I'm calling people characters now. Well, that's good, but honestly it feels so forced and doesn't feel authentic in the slightest. It's even worse when it comes to these harem series where just about every single girl at the school is in love with this main person who, well, can't really hold a conversation. Of course we have titles like Bottom Tier Character, Tomozaki, which actively tries to improve the main character throughout. And of course you have Konosuba, which actively makes the entire thing into a joke. Honestly, it doesn't really feel very authentic, and I often find these titles to be, well, like I said, just bits of escapism with very little substance. Now, there are a few examples of this done rather well. For example, the title I'm going to talk about is a manga. That's right, yes, it's a light novel channel, but we still appreciate manga here, and I feel like this has been done the best in this particular series. No matter how I look at it, it's you guys' fault I'm not popular. The main character, there's reasons why she isn't popular, it's blatantly apparent, but she works for it, and she genuinely does end up with a large circle of friends. You know what? If that is actually the end goal for some of these protagonists, to have friends, do that. Make that the main goal, to kind of make themselves better, or just, in this particular one, just somehow look out and end up being really popular by being really, really weird about it. Of course, this is a comedy series. It's not something that is, well, I'm saying it's not something that's relatable. In fact, I probably found this more relatable than most of this particular trope. It can be done well. This is living proof. Bland, overpowered protagonists. And while we're talking about protagonists, let's not forget bland protagonists. Now, this often goes in with the one I've just talked about, where they're popular for no apparent reason. But let's face it, there are some protagonists that their only interesting part about them is that they kind of got a special skill. The character themselves is pretty much non-existent, but they sure do have a special skill. How many times have we read a light novel and the only thing about the protagonist is that they're overpowered, be it physically or mentally, and it's usually the same plot thread over and over. I was reborn in another world where my upbringing was slightly tough, but I was lucky and was given this awesome power of insert world breaking thing here. So I'll do some quests and tackle everything with little to no effort, and all of the other characters will fall in love with me. And to be honest, that's the start and end of some of these characters. That's their entire personality, their backstory, which, let's face it, half the time is still somewhat copy-pasted. You know what, you can do a lot better than that. Bonus bad points if the protagonist is super morally good without question, and even more super bonus points if all of the girls within a 5-mile radius fall in love with him with pretty much no reason to. Infinite bonus points if the protagonist has to save a child in the first few chapters, because that always happens. Being overpowered isn't necessarily a crutch. You can be overpowered and still have a really good story about it. For example, One Punch Man. That is probably the gold standard for these overpowered characters. Of course, Saitama is an interesting character on top. He's not a copy/paste. We also have ones in light novels. For example, Tanya from the saga of Tanya the Evil. She is plenty overpowered when it comes to light novel standards, but she's also interesting as well. We have far too many of these ones where it's just same kind of story, same kind of character, same morality. I mean, I covered that particular title that I wasn't a fan of, where the hero was kind of just a jerk and started killing everybody, but at least it kind of made sense. At least the character was a little bit less generic. We can do so much better. We can have interesting characters and interesting worlds, but there's far too many light novels which just have the same character, same copy/paste backstory. The only interesting part of the character is that they have a single special skill. I am going to mention that I do have a bit of a soft spot for reborn as powerful thing stories. So, you know, if you are reborn as an overpowered slime, skeleton, sword, spider or vending machine, that's just unique and interesting enough that I kind of want to read the story. But reborn as yourself, yeah, probably not. Lack of adult protagonists. Adults are rarely the focus for light novels. Of course, it makes sense in a way. These things are written for high schoolers. But can we please have more titles that focus on adults? Again, another one, adult demographic, looking at stuff designed largely for young adults. But come on, when was the last time we actually had an adult character be reborn as an adult character? Sure, we've got the likes of Ainz and Tanya from their respective series. They were adults, but you know, that still kind of falls into the whole thing of, you know what, yeah, that's a skeleton, or that's a child soldier. It's not necessarily the same. Come on, we can have adults being reborn as adults in another world. I mean, they're probably not reborn as adults, but we can have adults in adult situations in another world, can't we? Granted, we have Sasaki and Peeps, but that one definitely feels like the exception to the rule. It's quite funny when you look at manga as well, that we do have a lot of manga that is about dads bringing up their daughters, and I can only really think of one example where that kind of continued into a light novel, and that example was a bit weird. It got a bit weird. I wasn't a fan of that particular series. But let's face it, how many times have we seen a title that the main protagonist is a grizzled war veteran? You know, he's seen it all before. He's been through the whole Isakai. This is why titles like Uncle from Another World kind of work, because, you know, it's a little bit different. How about, I don't know, a butcher is just kind of called up and is the only one surviving from a war and ends up being the hero thrown on him, but he kind of just wants to go back and be with his family and ends up having to save the world or some nonsense. You know, it's something at least unique. I don't know. It's something I would love to see a little bit more of, and if you do have some more good examples of this, let me know, because I want more adults as main protagonist. Adults are often made out to be the villains in these series, or just made out to be so inept that it just doesn't feel like something an adult would do. Or they're there for a different kind of reader. Give me more overworked salarymen in another world. I'll read all of them. Sexual harassment with minors. Your protagonist, usually in his late teens, starts sexually harassing girls younger than him. Or it's an adult reborn as a child sexually harassing other children. It's not something I feel is up for debate, but always makes me wince whenever I read it, and is an immediate red flag, and often than not, I'll just drop it straight away. Stats. Ah yes, stats. Now this is something, if done well, can be a very good tool, improving the flow of a novel. However, more often than not, I find these to be filler pages. Okay, so let's clear things up a little bit. If your character is in a game world, literally a game, an MMO, they're getting transported literally into Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, I'm fine with stats. It's when it's into another world, which is a fantasy world based on a game. At the end of the day, if I got transported into another world, stats are probably not going to start flying through the air. It's not uncommon for some light novels to literally slap pages upon pages of level ups or stats throughout a volume, and honestly, it's something that really irritates me. These stats rarely, if ever, have anything to do with the actual plot, especially if we are looking at overpowered protagonists where stats mean literally nothing because they're not going to have any issue fighting anything anyway. Of course, there are some particular series that make stats a focus. They make it important to the actual plot. I'm fine with them. Those ones are actually pretty good. Take, for example, Bootworm. Now, I know this is a game example, but you know what? She put all of her points into defense, and that's literally the important part of the story. More often than not, though, this is never the case. I get the idea that protagonists are sent to worlds very similar to games like Dragon Quest or Dungeons & Dragons, but it does break the immersion seeing pages of stats in a book where they're not really needed. Same fantasy worlds and plots. Speaking of Dragon Quest and Dungeons & Dragons, can we please have some more interesting worlds and plots? Please. Look, I get it. Dragon Quest in Japan is a cultural phenomenon. And when it comes to the West, nearly everybody has at least heard of Dungeons and Dragons who's going to be reading these type of novels. But come on, we can just be more interesting than that, can't we? I started my quest by saving the local girl or child, after which I joined the guild and found a tank, mage and waifu, before looking at the jobs board, and then ended up on an adventure to find the Demon King. I mean, let's face it, a lot of these titles literally take the plot from the first few Dragon Quest games, gussy it up a little bit, change a few things here and there, and more or less call it a day. They don't even take the unique monsters from Dragon Quest, which is kind of bizarre. I mean, I would love to see unique monsters in a lot of these. No, they take the monsters from Dungeons and Dragons because that's probably easier to explain than some weird monster that they just came up with on the fly. Even if we compare it to Dragon Quest, I mean, Dragon Quest has a ton of charm. It's not afraid to have goofy monsters and locals while also managing to be incredibly dark, and it covers a lot of its dark plots with a cheerful outlook, and in many cases those things really stick out for you. And let's face it, most Dragon Quest games at least feel like they're trying to do something new with the franchise, have some unique and fun characters, plot beats or enemies that just stick out for you. But let's take a few examples of how things stand out even in a fantasy world. First up, Xenoblade Chronicles combines fantasy with sci-fi and has the world on a bunch of giant titans. Despite it being a fantasy, it rarely feels like you were doing the same as every other series. Final Fantasy VII, that has you join a bunch of eco-terrorists to stop a mega corporation from using the planet's life force. Ys has Adol get shipwrecked again and again, but this sets up a lot of interesting premises. You could be on an island or in a prison city, and these stories are given enough to make the worlds feel interesting despite being in a regular world. Radiant Historia and Chrono Trigger both have you jumping around the timeline to fix things, while also screwing up other timelines, eventually getting the perfect one. Why can't light novels have more unique plots like these? And all of these are typical fantasy titles. They all exist in a fantasy world, yet they manage to do something unique or try to do something a little bit different with each installment, rather than just taking the same pretty tired plot and then just kind of calling it a day. That's not to say all light novels are like this. We have gems like Ascendance of a Bootworm, Overlord, Cooking with Wild Game and Infinite Dendrogram, among many others, knocking it out of the park by going at it slow, focusing on building up the world around you with interesting characters and locations and details. Of course you have the likes of Konosuba and Mom Isakai, which they kind of pull off a typical fantasy, but they also think about the world, they think about the backstory, while also just lampooning the entire absurdity of a lot of these generic fantasy worlds and plots. It's sad when titles like the Mob Isekai or Monster Girl Doctor have better thought out worlds than your regular fantasy title. And then you have the likes of Sabuki Bisco that absolutely knocks things out of the park with such a unique setting. It's an isekai, but why? This one really gets on my nerves. How many times have we seen an isekai title where the character starts off, gets reincarnated, mopes around for a little bit, and then, well, it pretty much never needs to come up ever again. They more or less instantly adjust to their new life in a fantasy world, usually a fantasy world. On Otome World, isekai can be done so well and can be used to unique effects, but so many series unfortunately fall into this hole. It's very uncommon that the protagonist even wants to go back to their original world. I mean, I do see some of the Otome ones where they're just kind of like, oh yes, I'm gonna die, I'm a villainess, which is another trope that kind of is a bit overdone at this point, but you know, I kind of get the whole thing. It's like, oh, well, you know, it's escapism, you could live in another world, there's no reason to want to go back. But for far too many titles, they kind of have, you know, one chapter, oh, I'm reincarnated in another world, I got hit by a truck, and then just kind of like, that's it. And it's just like, oh well, I joined the guild and that's about it. I'm now completely in this fantasy world. I don't know, I kind of would like to see a little bit more of a kind of debate. Oh, I want to go back, but will my family remember me? ReZero is one that does this absolutely fantastically well, and I don't really see many others that really do that. In some cases, the new life is way better than the old one. But at least try and do something that links in with their old life, or make it a little bit more relevant to the plot. I feel like some series kind of do a little bit. I mean, they have, you know, the protagonists invent ramen in another world. But let's face it, if you or me were transported to another world, would you be able to recreate all of those natural comforts that we've got over here? You might have a bit of an idea, but you're probably not going to be able to do so. I mean, that's one of the things that's so good about Ascendance of a Bootworm, which they do kind of do a lot of that. They do focus, oh well, you know, you might know how to kind of make it, but will you be able to do it? Do you have the power to do that? Probably not. Buying slaves. Now, this is another one that is just often done so badly, I just automatically, instantly drop titles when it pops up. And I think a lot of other people do too. The protagonist will need to get an ally of some kind, for whatever reason they can't get allies naturally, and then will go out and buy a slave. The hero buying slaves? Not a good look. I could understand if they free the slave or whatever, but a lot of light novels will either keep the slave as a slave, or do some convoluted way to say that they're not a slave, but basically so indebted to the protagonist that they're basically still a slave. It's uncomfortable every time I come across this, and it's definitely some kind of fetish or power play that's being forced onto you, the reader. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I thought it was only really Shield Hero that actually did this. So originally I started kind of just like, you know, oh well, you know, this one did it, it's not really that big of a thing. But then I started coming across more and more series that kind of have this as a major plot point, especially with the main kind of love interest character. Some have the slave fall for the hero while being a slave, others will have the hero manipulate them, but all of them just feel wrong. So very wrong. It's such a mixed message seeing protagonists be all, slavery is bad, and then still buy slaves because plot reasons. Definitely mixed messages there. And so those are some things I really do not like about light novels. Now, I kind of know that you guys are thinking, oh well, you know, that's pretty much every light novel. So that light novel guy, what light novels do you actually like? And I'm going to say